There's a phenomenon everyone senses, but no one seems able to explain. People create endless theories, endless remedies, all trying to reclaim youthfulness, trying to bridge that constant conflict between the younger body they remember and the older body they're forced to inhabit. One day they feel fine, the next day something breaks, and suddenly they're living in a body that feels foreign, unstable, or even frightening. And the world of experts still has no real answer for why this shift happens. What is the actual difference between a body that moved through life effortlessly in youth and the body that later collapses into pain, symptoms, and dysfunction? Of course, some rare individuals seem to glide through life blissfully. I've seen them. I had a patient in his 70s who told me he had never experienced a single symptom in his entire life. For the first time, when I looked at his x rays, I actually believed him. What I saw on those images told the entire story, why his body had remained stable for decades. And then I'll see someone in their 20s suffering debilitating symptoms. I look at their films and I see a completely different reality. You would think research would have answered this long ago. You would think someone would have mapped out the differences clearly. Instead, you see professionals proudly drawing lines on x rays, pointing to improvements in disc or on an MRI or a picture of a straighter looking body, more extended looking than before. Yet none of it correlates with the real difference between symptomatic and non symptomatic bodies. In fact, you can look up these success stories and find that later on it looks more like a complete failure, as a lot of times the effects are temporary. Well, I guess they need psychological healing, right? Or maybe it never worked because it never was true correction to begin with. In fact, the very changes that many techniques parade around as corrections are the same pathological patterns I find in the worst bodies I've ever examined. They are so blind to what they're actually causing that if they truly understood it, they would never advertise these results. These are not signs of correction, they're signs of deterioration. And I can say that confidently because almost no one understands the actual tipping point, the moment when a youthful, stable, non symptomatic body crosses a threshold and collapses into mechanical chaos. If they truly understood this mechanism, they would abandon most of the models, methods, and theories they've clung to for decades. But changing a mind that has been filled with bad education is not easy. Unlearning incorrect principles and replacing them with accurate, internally consistent understanding is a daunting task. And these lessons you're about to encounter are designed to do exactly that. Viewer discretion advised. You may find yourself severely triggered as you realize that despite your good intentions, you may have been reinforcing pathological patterns, not correcting them. This is your opportunity to finally understand what really separates a youthfully stable body from one collapsing under internal pressure. This is where the real science begins.
So, when it comes to the topic of trying to understand what a unstable lumbar spine is, it's probably one of the most important things that you can learn about the human body. Um, the lumbar spine is responsible for so much more than people give it credit for. And, there's this thought that you need to do stuff in other places of the body. And all that's kind of true because in the beginning, you're going to get some temporary effects doing corrections or manipulations. You'll get effects from both. Another topic I talked about manipulation versus correction. So if you haven't watched that, you don't understand what I mean. But other techniques that have been using manipulation, they notice that they get good effects when they do corrections, let's say, to the cervical spine. Even though there's obvious problems in the lumbar spine, they're kind of going for the front end effects. And what that means is in the beginning, you're making corrections and you're getting symptomatic relief. And that's on the front end. Okay. But on the back end, they're doing the same stuff and it's not working anymore. The reason for that is the lumbar spine, it systematically collapses. And so when it becomes unstable, and the person's in trouble and they have a lot of pressure built up inside their body because of the unstable lumbar spine, you're not going to be able to make corrections in the beginning to the lumbar spine that have any immediate or apparent effects. Although you are improving the person's body by shifting the lumbar spine in the correct direction even a tiny bit, it's just not going to be as dramatic as some other area of the body on any given day of treatment. So what's very unique about hydro is it sets the body up to be actually corrected in the lumbar spine later on down the road. And that's just what happens. And so the purpose of this video is to get people's mind wrapped around, because most people are anecdotal evidence, I do this and symptom gets better, therefore I'm right. And then I could do that forever and it's going to work. And sorry, that's just not how the body works, especially if you're dealing with systematic collapse of the body. You have to correct the body in the correct order in order to make any kind of relevant changes to the body. And when it comes to handling the lumbar spine, you look across the board, this has been the most mishandled area of the body by far compared to anywhere else. And what I mean is they haven't been able to correct the lumbars at all with any of these techniques, regardless of the symptomatic relief. They're just making the lumbar spine worse. And so fundamentally, you're making the whole systematic collapse worse. True, you can shift the systematic pressure somewhere else, and that might give the illusion of correction. But that shift always shifts onto something that hasn't been under pressure for too long, but it shifts with an increase in pressure. Now, this is a vast topic, so let me start somewhere that will give us our bearings to try and understand it later on down the road. Take an x-ray of children, okay? Maybe, I don't know, 8 or 9 or something like this. It could be younger. It doesn't really matter. The point is, when you look at the films, you're going to see that the child, in their body is never going to be aligned. It's never going to be the perfect example of spinal stability and correctness and structural soundness. There are going to be misalignments there. All right. And for the most part, although some children do have symptoms, they're going to be non-symptomatic. Okay. And if they do have symptoms, it may or may not, depending, maybe they had an accident or something like that. Of course, I'm not talking about that. But in general, they'll have these misalignments, but they won't hurt. Okay. And this is why the medical community has kind of thought chiropractic and structural stuff to be kind of quacky, because they see misalignments in children and they realize they don't have symptoms. And so they just think most of the structural theory out there is just bogus. Okay. And that's kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There's more that needs to be analyzed here to understand what's actually going on. Okay. Although it's true, that by the time you become an adult and you see these spinal misalignments and stuff, and then you become more symptomatic during that time, those misalignments have probably been there for quite a long time. as far back as when you were younger. So the question then becomes, what's the difference between a person who's younger and has misalignments, yet they don't have symptoms, or their symptoms are not as severe, as opposed to a person who, when they get older, suddenly start experiencing symptoms from those same misalignments? What is it that altered or changed in the person's body to create that, um, new effect of things suddenly becoming symptomatic and starting to hurt? And I've never actually heard that question asked. And you'll get around some of the top researchers, and it doesn't seem like that's an issue with them at all. Um, and it actually turns out to be pretty important because, this whole definition and body work of misalignment is just not even understood. So, how can you correct something if you don't even have a true definition or a true understanding about misalignment? Especially when you see misalignments happening in younger bodies and they're fine, there's nothing wrong with them as far as their symptoms or their mobility, and they're running around playing and doing all this stuff with their body and they don't have energy issues. But then when you get older, suddenly it becomes a huge problem. And you know that these structural problems have an effect on the body because you can do stuff to the structure when somebody is experiencing symptoms, and you can change the symptom. You can make it better, you can make them worse. The point is, you could change things. So it does have an effect. And just to say, oh, kids with misalignments, that's normal and that's part of life. Well, you actually can adjust kids as well, and it has an effect on them symptomatically as well. So that would point to logically that these misalignments are not doing the body any good, regardless of if they're causing symptoms or not. And so then it would be important to try and figure out uh, why these phenomenons are happening, such as kids have misalignments and they don't hurt, but yet adults, they have misalignments and they do hurt. Also, you should figure out the phenomenon of why is it that when I push the body around, it changes the symptoms, and if the result is it's temporary, well, why is it temporary? You need to ask these questions, or if you change the pressure and it turns out to be permanent, you should figure out, well, why did that occur, right? Or you should also figure out, this happens all the time. You do a manipulation and the person feels worse, and sometimes it's immediately they just, go into a worse acute state, symptomatically speaking. And, that's happened to anybody who's been in this profession for a long time that's been working on, tougher cases. They're trusted by their community. So the worst bodies are going to show up in that person's office, and when that happens, because the norm is people usually show up and they got little symptoms, and you can pretty much do whatever manipulation you want to that person, and they might seem fine. But then when that one comes in and you do the same thing, and all of a sudden they're worse, most people don't really see that as a sign that maybe fundamentally something about what I'm doing to people's body is flawed. They just kind of look at it as like a fluke, or maybe the person comes in and usually you do some kind of manipulation and they feel better, or you do whatever your modality is and they feel better, and then you do it to someone else and it has zero effect at all. It doesn't do anything. And typically what happens is people justify it, that are in these body manipulations. They never will go, well, maybe everything I think I know about the body, I'm completely wrong. That's just a place people's egos don't allow them to go. But if you went there, you probably discover a lot more. And that's kind of the purpose of this video, is to let you kind of know when you don't let ego get in the way and you just start looking at the reality of the situation, you're going to start seeing a lot more. And although the answer is pretty easy, the difference between a person who's young and a person who's older, and why the symptoms are increased when they get older as opposed to young, even though the same misalignments exist in their body. Well, one is they become heavier when they get older. That's true. And the other one is an unstable lumbar spine. And so it's a simple answer, and I gave you the simple answer. But to understand why that's true, it's more complex. So you'll have to buckle up and listen to a lot of data points in order to understand why that simple statement that I just said was true.
The first thing you must understand when looking at x-rays, evaluating the spine, or simply observing a person standing in front of you from any angle is this. You are never seeing just problems. You are seeing a combination of the body's problems and the body's own attempted solutions. The body is built for survival. It will adapt, twist, stiffen, and reshape itself in whatever way it must to keep functioning. Many of the symptoms people complain about are actually signs that the body is protecting them from greater harm. Degeneration itself is often a protective mechanism. Just like the calluses on your feet, many of the body's adaptations are there to provide support and stabilize function. They form for a reason, and in many cases, removing those calluses would actually make you worse, because you'd be taking away the very protection your body built to keep you safe. Yes, there are core underlying problems, but surrounding those core issues are layers upon layers of compensations, reactions, distortions, and survival-driven patterns. Most practitioners get hypnotized by the compensations. They chase the noise while missing the real culprit beneath it. For example, a person might feel drained, tense, and fatigued because of a core issue, but if that same person maintains a stable, positive emotional state, the body can often manage those stresses far better than if they live in chronic anxiety or emotional chaos. This is why so many businesses promote the idea that you must correct the body and correct the mind, because they're chasing anecdotal symptomatic changes instead of correcting the true structural foundation. And yes, there are hundreds of ways to temporarily influence symptoms or emotions. Some methods work for certain people, others do not. But when it comes to correcting core misalignments, there is truly only one correct way to fix them. Believe me, I wish there were a lot more ways to do it, but as it turns out, I don't make the rules, nor do those who masquerade around us as authority figures. Corrections are governed by physics. They are trapped under massive internal forces, hydraulic press forces, and the body will not release them through random adjustments or superficial methods. There's only one correct pathway to free them, and the truth is no one has been consistently correcting them, which means no one truly knows the full potential of what real correction can do. If we did, the entire landscape of health would look completely different. The truth is simple. A stable, correctly aligned body can handle stress with ease. It doesn't need constant emotional micromanagement or endless mind-body balancing. Those are useful crutches in the beginning, but they are not the solution. The solution is correcting the core before the body has been properly corrected. Life is always going to bring stress. That part is unavoidable. But what is avoidable is living in a body that collapses under that stress, because the core structure is compromised, and once you truly correct the body, everything becomes easier. Whereas if you ignore the real core problem, You'll spend years chasing temporary relief, building emotional crutches around the issue without ever actually fixing it, which is exactly why people stay stuck. Meanwhile, so many businesses, regardless of how polished they look or how much they charge, are often just collecting payment without producing real correction. Depending on what they do, they may even worsen the situation, offering a tiny morsel of improvement wrapped in an even larger package of new mechanical mistakes. The body, in its drive to survive, will accept any corrective input you give it, whether that input was intentional or not. But because most people's blueprint is wildly off compared to how the body actually operates, mistakes are inevitable. And when those mistakes happen, the body quietly compensates for every new misalignment, even if no one notices. The body, however, remembers everything. These issues accumulate over time. Don't fool yourself. There are always consequences, especially when core issues are never getting fixed. And while you still see many people proudly correct things that were never broken in the first place, the real deeper issue continues to be irritated and amplified beneath the surface. Nature needs what it needs. If you don't provide that, you're just chasing your tail again and again. Hydrostructural finally makes the distinction clear. The difference between chasing symptoms and understanding the body's true internal logic.